Hey, I'm Joe Brickman. I'm with Virtue Lab. I'm here speaking with you tonight, but I'm coming from the position of being Deputy Director and Director of Impact Strategy for Virtue Lab. I've been with the organization for about 12 years, been through a number of different iterations, but at its heart, Virtue Lab, as a nonprofit, we are targeting climate change, and we're doing that by making direct investments in clean tech startups and providing critical wraparound support with the goal of addressing climate change and also creating shared prosperity. So when we get into talking about impact, the two areas that I have the most background with are environmental and social. But of course, as others have alluded, there's many others. And I'm thinking about you folks in the room who are in life sciences or in the health sector. There are a lot of things that will translate, but I'll try to speak to that as we go, but it's definitely not my area of expertise. Prior to joining Virtue Lab, I spent about 10 years leading the sustainable design team at ZGF Architects, which I believe has an office there in Seattle still, but here in Portland. And through that process really came to learn how exciting it was to see new solutions get applied and to see the evolution of design over time as new solutions came to be available. And I really wanted to be involved in the creation of those new solutions. So excited to talk with you all later.
Cool.
I'll hand it off to Ken.
Yes, Ken, would you introduce yourself and then head on into the program?
Sure, glad to be with everybody this evening. Ken Vaughn, I'm the Director of Impact Investments at Virtue Lab and the manager of our most recent investing vehicle, the Virtue Lab Climate Impact Fund. And I've been with the organization for just over 10 years, all of that focused on funding startups in one way or another. And prior to that, I came up through engineering and product development, worked in a number of startups, including a couple of my own back when I was a much younger person. And also later got involved in some angel investing. I was a member of the Sacramento Angels for a while and involved with a couple of venture funds as well. And, really have enjoyed the ability to spend a lot of time talking to entrepreneurs, and especially those that are passionate about not only making money, but making a difference in the world, which is what I do for my day job.
Cool. Thank you so very much. My name's John Seacrest. I try to make things go faster with the open coffee for learning about startups, with the lean startup for a conversation about why you should do customer development, startup weekends. The next one is April 1st, and this angel conference. And then we have a fund manager peer learning group for angels that are working on professionalizing their investing. So that arc is where I work, and I'm trying to spread that out to other ecosystems as well. But Ken, please head off into the conversation about how do we incorporate impact and how do we think about impact in our investment portfolios.
Great, happy to do it. And so I'm going to start off with some context setting, talking a little bit more about Virtue Lab and about our current fund, just so you know where we're coming from. And I'll share some slides, and then after that we can pause and do some Q&A. And John, if while I'm presenting, others have questions, feel free to interrupt. Sometimes it's a little hard to follow the.
Yeah, I'll track the chat, and we can step in when there's a need for a conversation.
Yep. And then I'll hand the baton to Joe, who is on our team the most focused about impact forecasting, impact measurement, has done a deep dive over the last 2 or 3 years into resources, frameworks, methodologies, and has led the effort at Virtue Lab in helping us to apply some of that thinking to our latest fund. And we're also already talking about our next fund. So we're thinking about some of the learning from our current fund as we move forward. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Hopefully you won't see too much. And can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Thank you. So first, just a little bit about Virtue Labs. So we are a catalyst organization, and as Joe mentioned, we're a nonprofit, but we invest in for-profit companies for mission purposes. And historically, we've always been focused on environmental challenges and clean tech, and then more recently, we've narrowed our focus even a little bit more to a lot of focus on climate change. But our mission is to unleash innovation and entrepreneurship that will solve environmental challenges and catalyze shared economic prosperity. And we do that today with a couple of different main thrusts. One is entrepreneurial support programs. We co-manage with the Clean Tech Alliance, the Cascadia Clean Tech Accelerator, which is an accelerator program that's focused exclusively in clean tech. So it has a lot of the same kind of curriculum that any business accelerator program would have, but it also has some additional curriculum related to developing hardware innovations versus software, or selling into regulated markets, or thinking about the impact you're having and how to talk about that and how to measure it and how to communicate it to customers or investors. We also run an SBIR, Sttr assistance program that helps startup companies or small businesses go after federal R&D grants from the various agencies of the federal government. It's a very large program. I think it's $4 billion, if I'm thinking right, annually, that's available for research and development. And that's been a very successful program for us in the state of Oregon. And then we've recently been able to expand that into the other states in the Pacific Northwest by virtue of a grant from the Department of Energy. And we focus on catalytic capital and impact first investing in promising startups. And that's the area that I have responsibility for. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the idea of impact first investing in a little bit, but that is kind of related to our status as a nonprofit. Just to kind of give you a snapshot of some of our past investing, some examples of the type of companies that we have invested in the past. The common themes here are, it's pretty much always very early stage, frequently called pre-seed or seed stage investing. There's no precise definitions for that, but it's frequently the first money in after the founders and their friends and family have run up their credit cards, and they haven't made enough progress to attract institutional venture capital. And so sometimes we're the only investor, and sometimes we're co-investing with angel investors or co-investing with other small impact funds, similar to our own. So we have a couple of our companies that have gone from humble beginnings to $1 billion plus IPOs, or one was $1 billion plus IPO. Arcimoto was also an IPO, unfortunately not quite that big, but a number of companies now that have grown up and are scaling up, and we're proud to have been a part of their early success. And so with regard to our new fund that I mentioned, this is a sort of an overview of the fund that'll give you a little bit of context of how we think about impact and how we apply it. And this is a case. Our fund is a case of impact investing, and that's that's a kind of an umbrella term that a lot of people use and sometimes have completely different meanings. But the one common denominator usually is that people are seeking impact alongside financial returns. But the way we think about that is that it's kind of a continuum between philanthropy that you see on the left, which is focused on impact only, and venture capital that you see on the right, which is focused on making money only. And then in between would be varying degrees of investing that are focused on impact. Our fund has a $5 million target. We're in the closing days right now of finishing our fundraising and have already started investing. We call it catalytic capital. Again, there's no universal definition for that, but we think it's the best way to describe the investing that we're doing. And of course, people investing in this fund get some level of portfolio diversification because it's structured as a fund. The overall impact goal that we seek is scalable greenhouse gas reduction. And so everything that we invest in, everything we look at has an eye towards greenhouse gas reduction as that product grows up and comes to market. As I mentioned, we use an impact-first investing style, and we invest in the US and Canada. And the impact-first investing style is kind of an important definitional idea around our fund, and it ties into some of the tax laws that we as a nonprofit operate under. And if you are a foundation, you can invest in two different ways. That's a foundation, a different type of nonprofit. You can do mission-related investing, which is investing out of your endowment or the corpus of the foundation, investing in anything. You're investing in stocks and bonds and real estate and cash and whatever. And to the extent that you take some of your endowment or all of your endowment and you line it up with your mission, then you become a mission-related investor. And there are some foundations now that have actually made that transition to where 100% of their endowment is aligned with their mission. I would refer you to one like Edwards Mother Earth Foundation as a good example. And then in that foundation on the other side of the house that's normally doing grant making, you can also do a different type of investing that's called program-related investing. And we operate under the same type of guidelines that a foundation doing program-related investing would operate under, and that's generically called impact-first investing. So what that means is that we invest for the purpose of our mission that I talked about before, solving environmental problems, growing the green economy, and that has to be the reason that we're investing. It's also okay if we make money in the process, and there's no limit on how much money an impact-first investor can make investing in our style. But the decision has to be tied to our mission. And we focus on filling the capital gap for hardware-oriented, typically early stage climate tech ventures that are frequently either too early or too risky for more conventional institutional investors. And so that risk sometimes is just technology risk. They may have a very promising innovation, but it may not be fully proven yet that it's going to work. Or it might be that the team is not fully formed, or it might be that the product is going to take a number of scale-up steps before it reaches the market. And those are things that conventional institutional investors shy away from for very good reasons. And so it creates a bit of a capital gap, and we fill that gap with our fund. And our fund is open on the capital formation side to foundations, to corporations, and to individuals. Most of the people participating individually are participating through their donor-advised fund, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's sort of a streamlined personal foundation. And once you set it up, you can steer where it goes. And one of the things you could steer it to would be a fund like ours. In terms of our selection criteria, and here's where the impact lens starts to come into focus. We have some top tier filter criteria and then additional factors that we look at. So in terms of filter criteria, the first thing we look at is climate impact potential. And that is how, if this company reaches market and the product is a success, how much climate impact will it have? And we get at that with some impact modeling tools, both others and some that we've developed. And Joe will talk more about this in her segment. Then we are also looking at the commercial success potential. And that would be all the same things that angels or early stage VCs would look at in terms of product market fit and the team and intellectual property and all those things. And I'm sure this group is quite familiar with those things, or we'll be working with each other on those things. So I won't spend time talking about that. And then we have a third criteria, which is this additionality criteria. And this goes back again to our nonprofit status. And that is making a judgment as to whether this is a company that we believe will struggle to raise the capital they need to be successful, and therefore they're at risk of dying on the vine or having stunted growth and therefore not achieving the climate impact that we're seeking. So within that framework, we also look at additional factors. We look to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the teams and in the policies of the companies. That's not a filter. We do sometimes invest in companies that might be an all-white male founder team, but we want to be sure that they are committed to DEI in terms of how they build out the company. And we sometimes attach investment contingencies to our investments to try to encourage them to do that. We also look for things that can have a direct impact on frontline communities, the people who are, first to be affected by climate change typically, and worst affected by climate change. And we can't always find this in our investments, but to the extent that the investments have that more direct impact on frontline communities, then we think that's a positive thing in our evaluation. And then we also look to be sure that if we are investing in inexperienced teams, which we frequently are, technical teams, first-time entrepreneurs, that they have an external support system through accelerator programs or advisory boards to be sure that they have the support that they need. Just some examples of the fund investments so far. We've actually made 5 investments, so we have not announced the most recent one, but here are the 4 that we've invested in so far. Blue Dot Photonics, which is a UW spin-out focused on advanced materials to make solar panels more efficient. Harvest Thermal, a company in California that is focused on the electrification of people's homes and sort of rethinking space heating, water heating, cooling, and using your water tank as a thermal storage device to be able to get more solar onto the grid. And this is a big wave. This is one of the big waves. Electrification of everything is one of the big waves in the climate tech sector. And this is a company that is trying to harness that to make their product succeed. Opconnect is a Portland-based company focused on electric vehicle charging stations. And there's a lot of players in that market, but they are particularly focused on low-cost solutions for apartments, condos, and fleets. And then Induction Food Systems, located in North Carolina, is bringing induction systems to industrial processes. And there are, tera BTU, it's a very big number of heat that's generated in industry today, typically with natural gas-fired boilers in process heating to be used in producing food and beverage and chemicals. And so they have a product that's electrifying some of those processes. And that's me. And I'll put my contact information in the chat here as well. And let me stop there and see if anybody had questions about that before I pass the baton to Joe.
So as a nonprofit, you're pretty tightly wearing the nonprofity hat with the concessionary model of investing. And some of us don't have a concessionary model, and in fact believe to have impact is by necessity to have scale. And therefore, in order to have scale, concessionary investing is not the appropriate pathway, right? We believe in making money and doing good at the same time. And so perhaps you can talk a little bit about your limited partners in your fund and how the language of concessionary impact investment aligns with how you got people into the fund, and why that's important and how that might be different if you were talking to non-concessionary investors.
Yeah, and thanks for that question, John. And I'm glad you asked that. And we think about it a little bit differently. And as I said, in that spectrum of impact investing that I mentioned, there are a lot of different ways to go at that. And purely concessionary investing is one of those ways. Just to say, I don't care if I make money or if I make as much money, I want to support that entrepreneur because I believe in them, or I want to invest in that space because it's an important space to invest in. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is some people take their entire portfolio and they just do a carve out. They say, I'm going to take 10% of my money and I'm going to invest it with a high focus on impact, and the rest of it I'm going to focus with a high focus on making money. So we don't do either of those things, and we have a little bit different approach. And so you have to kind of follow the logic a little bit here. And that is, we don't get this scalable impact that we're seeking unless the company succeeds and grows up and reach a high degree of commercial scale. And to get that commercial scale, they have to have a product that's going to sell to customers and be able to make a profit on it and pay their employees, et cetera, et cetera. And typically they're going to need to raise money after us in order to get there. And the investor after us is most likely going to be a market rate, financially oriented investor that certainly has no concessionary ideas at all. And so when we're investing, we're looking for the companies that have that potential for that big commercial success in order to have the big scale. And so to have that big commercial success, they have to have all those same earmarks that financial investor is going to look for. As I mentioned in our selection criteria, we're looking at those same exact kind of criteria when we look at those companies. And as I mentioned, sometimes we're co-investing with an angel, some angels, or a small fund that has no concessionary methodology at all, and they're looking at it through the lens of making money. And so and I guess the other thing to note would be, we typically, when we're investing, we're going to use an instrument like a convertible note or a safe agreement or something like that, that will, at the next round, will convert probably into equity on terms that are set by the market rate investors that, again, have no concessionary methodology. And so our investment, even though we're making an investment focused on impact first, our investment is going to get onto that same spectrum as it finds co-investors or finds the next round of investors, and terms are set by those kind of investors. And so and this never happens, but if, for example, we invested and then 2 years later, the first conventional money invested, and then we converted in that round on their terms, it would be true that we might have a longer holding period on that investment, and that's going to have a hit on our IRR. And so there might be some level of concession associated with that, number one. Number two, in this fund, and this wouldn't necessarily be true going forward, but in this fund, we also have a cap in terms of the participation. It's actually a debt instrument, and it's up to a 15% compounded interest rate, and so it's capped at 15%. So if you think of it in venture capital terms, it might be sort of like a middling. If it performs really, really well, it might be sort of a middling performing venture capital rate of return. And so how do we get people in? We get people in mainly because of who we're dealing with. We're dealing with, as I mentioned before, foundations that are doing things for mission purposes, where investors are coming through their donor advised fund. So it's money they've already given away, and they can now invest. And if it is successful, it'll come back to their donor advised fund account, and they can redeploy it. Or sometimes it's basically just individuals. We have individuals that are investing that understand that we're investing at a very risky part of the spectrum. They recognize that, they understand that, but they're really worried about climate change. They're worried about their kids. They're worried about their grandkids. They have the ability, they have a large enough investment portfolio that they can set aside some funding for this kind of an investment. And so they're investing in the fund out of their investment portfolio because of those mission purposes. So that's a way to kind of think about that distinction between our fund and a conventional seed stage fund.
And so we have a workshop that we did a while ago about how to be an impact venture capitalist using donor advised funds. I put it into the chat. It's really a very useful methodology. So anybody can create a donor advised fund. Impact Assets and Legacy Global are two examples of organizations that allow you to set up an impact fund. So if you like what Ken's doing, you could go door to door in your neighborhood and raise money for your DAF and then invest it into his fund. That would be a completely legal and appropriate thing to do if you were mission driven to make that go, because as a donor advised fund, all of the financial benefit of that investment goes back to the fund, not to you individually. And so you need to understand that. So there's a very wide range of people who choose to do philanthropy and give it away, but don't understand philanthropic investing, which is a fundamentally different task than granting money away, which may have concessionary returns, which is I just want my money back so I can invest it again, versus I really want my 3x money so I can invest 3 times the next time around. And so you have to decide what your financial model is in a separate pile than what your mission is, essentially. So just wanted to do the plug for what I'm putting into the chat. Any other questions people have for Ken about what he's doing with his fund? So Sophia, you came in a little bit late, didn't do an introduction, but you're doing a sustainability bent thing that has tokens and hardware and economics and all sorts of crazy things in it. You want to ask Ken a question about his sustainability thesis?
Ken, I'm so sorry I missed absolutely everything except for the last 2 slides. So I apologize for my tardiness. So Sophia Levis, CEO of Eversmart City, we utilize shipping containers to build affordable housing. We use renewable energy. We have sustainable agriculture, and we're fully integrated with blockchain technologies. So we're tokenized. And yeah, I had a lot of questions. I'm so sorry that I couldn't make it any sooner. So I've just been trying to look up, is that how you spell it? Because I'm not finding the virtual lab spelled that way.
VER, yeah, virtuelab.org.
Oh, .org. Okay, got it. So I will look you up. But what and I apologize if you're repeating yourself. Going forward, what are your guys' interests in investments?
Yeah, we're looking for investments that can move the needle on climate change in a significant way. Can be a successful business because of business fundamentals, and that can attract downstream investors, sell products commercially, and that might be at that stage where they have a little challenge in raising more conventional dollars because of early stage risk, typically. And therefore we can justify investing as a catalytic nonprofit investor.
And at what part do you guys invest in? Do you do like pre-seed, seed, round Series A? Where are you guys? What's your sweet spot?
Pre-seed and seed only.
Okay.
So they're very early. Actually, what they really are, just to be cynical, is they're friends and family of people that are doing hardware icky things that regular tech investors won't touch because it's got icky hardware in it. And they're particularly fond of university developed technology. Am I reading between the lines of what you're saying accurately?
Indeed.
Yeah, that's pretty close. Although we don't restrict ourselves to the university spinouts, but we like them. We certainly like deep tech, hard science type stuff because it sort of fits our model.
So I went to the ICAR pitches today at UW, and there's lots of examples of scientists that are pitching their technology that have strong need for tuning on their customer development and team. And so you tend to be in the middle of those meetings, right? Mm-hmm. So Sophia is completely the opposite side of this thing, right? She's off in blockchain land, self-funding herself with crypto weirdo things, trying to get people to do a community together using a DAO. And so her problem is that she's got people that don't know what the words I just used are. So do you have a crypto thesis in your impact world view?
Was that a question for me? Or
yeah.
Not in this fund. We don't. We are looking at some companies that are doing blockchain for energy ideas. Blockchain is actually a pretty interesting idea for distributed energy resources, where you have a lot of people with solar panels, storage at their homes, buying and selling energy back and forth to the grid. And blockchain can be a pretty interesting idea for dealing with that. One of the problems, however, is the very energy intense methodologies used today in blockchain can defeat the purpose, because you're using a lot of energy to mine those crypto coins in most cases, which is bad for the environment. And so we are looking at that space, and we've seen some deals in that space. We're looking at deals in that space, some of which are trying to find more energy efficient ways to do blockchain than you would find underlying Bitcoin, for example.
So you mean, when you're talking about blockchain, you mean cryptocurrency, right? You're talking about.
Yeah, not necessarily currency, more just using blockchain for the settlements of people selling electrons back and forth to each other on a distributed grid.
Okay, so we use carbon neutral only. We do proof of stake. We don't do proof of work for our mining and for all of the stuff that we do. So we're carbon neutral. Our city's carbon negative.
So clearly
so
she wants to apply to you and ask you for a convertible note. So where does she go to sign up?
Absolutely. So you go to our site, virtuelab.org, and you look on the Entrepreneurs tab. And on the Entrepreneurs tab, you'll see some of our programs, and then you'll also see something about the Climate Impact Fund. And you click on that, and then you'll get to a description of eligibility and an application form. It's a pretty straightforward application. We ask for a pitch deck and some information, if you have it, about how your product delivers climate impact and how it's quantified, if you have quantified it, and then demographic questions, and pretty straightforward application.
Any other questions from folks for Ken? So Brian, are you there, or have you gone and gotten a coffee?
I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah. So Brian, you're doing something about getting electricity to the right place at the right time. You want to put 2 cents into the conversation?
Sure. So with flex charging, since we shift vehicle charging to off-peak times during the day, first, we try to save money for drivers. Second, we can save money for utilities at scale by meaning they don't need to build as many power plants or expand the distribution grid. And then third, we are using a marginal CO2 emissions signal that tells us exactly when the best time of day is to charge a car based on the grid emissions in every 5-minute interval. And so with that, we can do some really smart optimization work. And it does depend on the season and the utility and the grid mix at that time. But on average, we think we can save 25% of all the carbon emissions used to charge a car.
And so here's the place. Brian is an alumni of SAC as an investor, and he's also an alumni of SAC as a company. And he has an ongoing problem getting investors to pay attention because he's got all of these hand-wavy utility things in it. And so from a Ken Vaughn Virtue Lab kind of perspective, does what he do fit into your charter in a way that's worth him paying attention, or should he go off to his merger and acquisitions journey next month?
Yeah, well, from what I heard, it sounds quite interesting. It sounds like it's in our sector, in our space. As I mentioned before, we have invested in an EV charging company already. That's a growing space. And, so long as it's, pre-seed stage, can have a lot of impact on climate, which it sounds like it can, then we'd certainly be interested in learning more.
Cool, thank you. So I see a note from Bert around this question of accounting for your impact, right? So we go and do an impact investment, and everybody does their Tom Shoes hand wave about how they're making the world a better place, but then they just go and do business. Yeah, go ahead, Bert.
There are a number of different protocols out there, and some of them are older, some of them are newer, about how to measure the emissions from a business. And they both are, there's 3 levels of it, in fact. There's tier 1 and tier 3.
So I want to back up a little bit to just the Ken. when you say you're doing impact investing, how are you tracking that you're actually getting impact?
Specifically on greenhouse gas emissions, because impact is a very big issue.
Well, so I'm more broad on the whole, what the hell do we mean by impact, right? Do I mean social
Fair
impact?
enough.
Do I mean economic impact? Am I creating jobs in a place that reduces commuting? All sorts of weird ways that people think about impact. What does that look like for you guys?
I think those.
How do you track it?
I think those will be good questions for Joe, who is going to
Okay.
talk about our frameworks and methodologies and tools and other things.
Cool.
So maybe if there aren't other questions about our fund, I could just pass the baton here and she could start touching on that.
Let me scan the audience here for a second and see. All right. So Larry, you've got an active business that claims to impact the world. And how are you thinking about angel investing and it intersecting around this?
So thank you. Yeah, that is our aspiration, to impact the world. We're tackling the single largest contributor to landfills, construction and demolition waste, by helping to divert a significant portion of construction and demolition waste over time away from landfills and into new construction and other creative uses. So that is our destination. What else did you?
Well, so are you looking for angel funding at the pre-seed stage?
We are at the pre-seed stage.
Were you aware of Ken and what he's doing?
I was not aware of Ken and what he is doing, nor Joe and what she is doing, and I appreciate that immensely, because it seems like quite a good parallel to what we're doing. We are a pre-seed. We are just actually engaged with fundable.com. And so we're about to.
For those of us that are ignorant, what's fundable.com?
Fundable.com is they call themselves a crowdsourced platform, but it is only accredited investors allowed onto it. So
Cool.
Yeah. So we're engaged with them.
So how does that impact what you're doing, Ken? If he's got a crowdsourced thing going, would you play, or would that be noise for you?
It's a really interesting area right now. 2-3 years ago, I think us and most angel investors I had talked to at that point in time, or small funds, were really afraid of venturing into that space, and worried about the kind of the number of people on the cap table, worried about, are we encouraging people who have no business investing in risky early stage startups to invest in risky early stage startups? And do we have some reputational risk associated with that? Over the last, year or so, I think that mindset has shifted quite a bit, and people are really starting to see the benefit and impact and how those kind of platforms play a role. And we're increasingly seeing companies that may have done a WeFunder campaign, or have a WeFunder campaign, or on one of the other platforms, and raising quite a bit of money, raising $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. I think WeFunders just increased their limit to $5 million.
Yeah, federal law just changed.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
And one thing they're saying to us is, we need a lead investor in, for example, our campaign, who I guess WeFunder made that a requirement. You have to have a lead investor. They have to be public, and they're saying to us, if Virtue Lab was our lead investor and did the diligence and was willing to talk about why we invested, that would add a lot of credibility and would attract a lot of other capital, and so it could have a real catalytic effect. And so I would say we are open to that. We looked hard at one deal like that and decided to pass on the deal, but not for that reason. And so, under the right circumstances, we might, happily participate in one of those fundraisers. Although I think our favorite idea would actually be doing the diligence and being the lead and being visible to attract other people to it, because we could think of that as having a catalytic effect on other investors coming to the table.
So Ken, following up on that, we have actually envisioned a process like that, finding a lead investor to do that, to stimulate the activity on the platform and to provide that sort of the validation. And like John has said, did I know of you? No. So I am happy to know of you. I hope you're happy to know of me. I think
go to the website and hit the application thing and make sure Ken gets a chance to look at your due diligence.
Happy to look at it, Larry. We know a little bit about what you're doing. We have worked in that space a little bit in the past, diverting things from landfills, and there's a surprising amount of methane happening in those landfills associated with textiles and lots of other things, which are a huge greenhouse gas problem. And so happy to look at it in that regard.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Michael Irving, have you done any contemplation about how shellfish is sustainable?
Yeah, lots. I sort of fill all of the blanks that Ken's talking about here. But the farm runs carbon negative, and with smart oysters and smart seaweed, we can measure our carbon credits.
Cool.
They're figuring somewhere around 300, and I just read it this morning, 346 tons of carbon. And it works out to be about 1,700 an acre in carbon credits.
So,
but yeah, I'm interested. I don't know how interested you guys are in shellfish, but
I think perhaps
it sort of solves the world's problems.
The scalability of the process, right? So Ken has a desire for making scalability work, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Bert suggests that there could be a significant amount of leverage with Virtue Labs being a lead on deals. Bert, you want to talk to that?
I'm still here.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, from my opinion, and I'm speaking actually as an impact investor myself, and I've made several investments, and one of them's doing well, and the other one's meh. So Virtue Labs has a reputation of doing really good work at an early stage, and I, as an investor, would be looking to, if VL does due diligence on a company and says, we're going to put money in, I don't care if you write a check for $50,000 or $100,000 or even $20,000. I believe that your due diligence is worth my attention. And that's where I think that you can leverage your skill set a whole lot more for the dollar value. So I hope you do it. Write small checks, but make your team do a lot of work. And then crowdfund it. And everybody will follow you because you're smarter than they are. Yay.
All right. So I've poked the crowd enough. So Ken, what would you like to do next?
Why don't we have Jo do her presentation and get into some of the questions about methodologies and tools and frameworks, and then we can talk more after that.
Cool.
Sounds good. So I'm going to preface this. It's been really interesting to kind of, I'm glad I'm going second because I'm getting the benefit of hearing some of this conversation and getting to know you all a little bit better. And so one concern that I have in being relevant for everyone is that we're all in kind of different places and have different sectors that we're thinking about. So I'm going to think about this as like the beginning of a conversation. And if any of you have questions where you want to go deeper on a particular topic or whatever, I definitely don't want to be too lightweight. And yet, we've got some folks who are deep into sustainability accounting, for example, which is way in the weeds for a lot of you. And then we've got others who are maybe just new to this. So I don't want to leave any of you in the dust or bore the heck out of you. So I'm just going to put that out there and say, if you have further questions, I love having conversations about this topic. And I had my contact information in the chat, but I'll put it in again since some of you came later. A couple of things. So I don't think I get into this in my slides, so I wanted to be sure that I covered this. You know, the easiest form of impact investing is when you have just a complete filter, like I only invest in this, or I never invest in that. And that's not what we do. So we've had to come up with ways of kind of qualifying certain things. And like, I think Ken talked about this, you know, we don't exclude investing in white male-led companies, but there are some requirements that we have to have in place for companies that are led by solely white male-led teams, to be sure that we're going to get the quality out of the company that is more assured by having a diverse team on board. The evidence points to greater performance and, you know, sooner getting to revenue, et cetera. So just, it's a smart business move, and it's also the right thing to do, it turns out. So, you know, we have processes in place, I would say, rather than strict Boolean switch kind of guidelines. I would say as a newbie to impact investing, it might be simplest to just pick something that is your one thing that you're really interested in doing and start there. And I'm going to get into a little bit of sort of how we came to what we're doing. But our history, it's really interesting. You know, we started out actually as an economic development organization, a technology-based economic development organization, and have really evolved over time. And we started making investments in the late 2010, early 2011, and we're actually making grants to companies in that time frame. And at the time, we were looking at it as it is clean tech and has promise, or it's not clean tech and it's not very promising. And it was basically one or the other of those things. And we didn't really get into how much impact could it have and trying to quantify that. And I think the primary reason for that was that we had such a broad swath of technology areas that we're investing in. What is clean tech? You know, it could be a water technology company that's looking at water quality, or it could be a water quantity, efficiency company, or it could be a waste management company, or, and comparing apples to oranges is the hardest thing about sustainability, because there's so many different ways to do that.
Zebras.
Okay, apples to zebras.
Yep.
It's hard to do comparing those things. So I think because nobody else was asking us to, frankly, we were really just looking at, okay, what are the economic development metrics? How many jobs are these people creating? How much revenue is it bringing in? And then how much follow-on investment can this company attract? And those were the three things we were really looking at after the fact. And we have, a decade plus of track record with those. But as we became more squarely interested in putting impact first and being an impact investor, it becomes a lot more complicated to have such a wide range of things that you're trying to compare. So I'm going to get into a little bit more about that, but I just kind of wanted to give that as we haven't always been doing it this way, and we've stayed really focused for a reason. I'm going to start here. I just would love to get a confirmation that folks can see that. Good. Okay. Thanks, John. All right. So one thing I really like to emphasize is that it's we're really not doing this for somebody else at this point. It's really making sure that we're meeting our mission as an organization. And you might think about that for any impact investor. If you're an impact investor, you have a mission of some kind. It could be broad, it could be narrow, but you have a mission. There's something you're trying to achieve, and you're trying to confirm. We're kind of trying to confirm whether you're doing that effectively and whether the investments that you're making are having the impact that you're seeking to have. And so that's just kind of the bigger picture lens. And I think the same goes for companies, frankly. Is my company doing what we're intending to do from an impact perspective? And I'm not doing this for Virtue Lab. I'm doing this because it's going to make my company run better. So we have sort of three key reasons why at Virtue Lab we measure impact. It's to help guide our programs. It helps us make sure that we're looking at important global challenges. It guides our decision-making for our investments. We are able to help our companies attract different kinds of capital than they would be able to attract without this kind of impact in data. And that helps them operate better, both on a social, from a social perspective and from an environmental and economic perspective. And then lastly, the people who are interested in what we're doing, they want to see what our impact is. We are, as a nonprofit, trying to, garner more investment into the work that we're doing and the work that our companies are doing. And by telling our story effectively and talking about the impact that these companies can have, that it makes an immense amount of difference in terms of our ability to reach those folks and bring more people to the table. So in about 2016, I started researching what would it take to get from just talking about economic standards to talking about, or metrics, talking about a broader variety of things. And so I went about interviewing impact investors from all over, big venture firms, and smaller, more local angel investors, et cetera, and really focused on a few key things that were repeating through all those interviews. The first is to keep it simple, especially for the stage that we're talking about. We're talking seed, pre-seed, angels, not that different. They're small companies. We don't want to burden them and make them operate less effectively by asking them to, not just for us, but like imagine how many other investors are asking them for different things. Keep it simple. Let's, keep it to things that you can actually do something with. Imagine that you're going to get all this data in. If you collect it and don't have anything that you can do with it, it's going to be a waste of everyone's time. Utilize standard metrics. There's a great database that was created through a huge partnership of different impact investing organizations, but led by the Global Impact Investing Network, or GIN. The IRIS database, it just keeps evolving and getting better. At the time that I did this, it was great, but it just keeps getting better. And they've got like metrics sets for different interest areas within impact investing. And you can imagine if we're talking about a handful of investments from that database, there's hundreds in there, and there's so many different types of impacts that you might be looking at. It's a fascinating read if you're into this kind of thing. And then, lastly, and I already touched on this, that sort of the cost benefit analysis. If I capture this information, am I going to want to have to deal with it? And is it going to be really hard for people to gather this? How worthwhile is this? And then speaking to global frameworks, I've mentioned IRIS already, but the Sustainable Development Goals are useful in framing what are the big issues around sustainability. And these relate to health and poverty and water and, biodiversity, the whole gamut. And most of the individual measures are really relevant at the country scale, not so much an individual impact investor. So as a set of metrics, it's not particularly useful, but as a way of kind of figuring out what your lane is going to be, it can be really helpful. And it's a good way to kind of communicate to other impact investors around which goals you care about and what you're focused on. Project drawdown for us as a climate investor, of course, is really important. And I can't really see everybody right now as a presenter, so I don't really know how many of you have heard of this. So I'll just assume that you don't know about it. It is an enormous project that was undertaken by the author and the entrepreneur Paul Hawken to work with hundreds of fellows from around the world to gather data around the potential for individual solutions to climate change to have an impact. And they looked at all of the best third-party validated sources of data about impact. And they also looked at costs and time and all of the different factors, and they came up with a list of I think it was over 100 different solutions, ranked them, priced it out, sort of figured out what would it take for us to get to drawdown, which is the time at which we basically reach stasis, and we've drawn down the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that we've added, and we are at a safe place. So that's a really valuable one if greenhouse gas emissions are important to you. They don't just focus on carbon. It's all of the methane and all of the things. Impact management project, I want to talk about a little bit more, because I think could be really useful for those of you who are relatively new to impact investing as a framework. And, this is another one of those things that since 2016, there's been a lot that they've developed. They've developed a lot more tools for impact investors to actually do tracking and things through their project. And for companies and investors both. Because we've invested so much in our own tools, we haven't really engaged as much in it recently, but I still believe these 5 impact dimensions that they talk about are really important to framework to kind of think about what are the different things that are important when you're thinking about impact. What is the outcome? Is it a positive outcome or a negative outcome? That's sort of what is the impact that we're talking about? Who, that dimension is really about who experiences the outcome. This is going to come up later when we talk about DEI. How underserved are the affected stakeholders in relationship to the outcome? How much? And this is another one that's really important for Virtue Lab, right? How much of the outcome is occurring across scale, depth, and duration? We're at Virtue Lab, we're talking about the greenhouse gas emissions reduced between today and 2050. So we're forecasting the potential for impact that this company will have over the lifetime of the business. Other impact investors do it differently. Some look at how much has already occurred. And it just depends on the stage at which you're investing, and particularly that, because most of our companies aren't emitting anything themselves, anything more than any, 2-person office would. So the direct emissions aren't super large. Contribution, would this change likely have happened anyway? And this is that additionality thing that Ken was talking about primarily from an economic perspective, but additionality has all kinds of meanings in the impact world of, if not for this investment, what would have happened, right? What's the business as usual? And would this company have been on the arc to achieving this anyways, or would this industry have been on an arc to achieving this anyways? That contribution piece is key. And then lastly, risk. How certain are you that you're going to get the impact that you are hoping for or banking on in this case? So I think, this impactmanagementproject.com is a super helpful website. This is just the top level. They go into depth on each one of these and help you kind of think that through. And I really always recommend this as a great entry point for people who are just getting familiarized with it. We already covered that. The climate impact assessment tools that we use at Virtue Lab, when we're talking about emissions reduction potential, this is essentially a product of what the individual product greenhouse gas emissions reduction would be beyond the baseline. So let's say you have a high efficiency HVAC unit, right? Then you'd be looking at what is the type of HVAC unit that would typically be installed that most of your customers would be utilizing if your product didn't exist. That's your baseline, and then you look at how many emissions would be resulting from that baseline product's use, and then you're looking at the delta between that and what this new innovation of yours would do. Typically, this looks like a percentage, and then you multiply that by the number of products that you can expect to be sold at the projected addressable market. I go into a lot more detail on this in a video that's actually available on our website. So if you go to that Climate Impact Fund and you follow, there's links to how to apply. We walk through exactly how to do this. We have our own climate impact assessment that we use, but we often utilize a tool that's called Crane. That is an open source tool, no cost to use it. It utilizes a lot of that same data that they used for Project Drawdown. It was done in partnership with them. So there's really good sources of third-party data on emissions reduction potential. So I usually use that as a first place to start, and then we get really specific into what that company's market is. It's just the next level. On the social side, on diversity, equity, inclusion, I kind of hinted at this earlier. We're looking for companies that demonstrate diversity, equity, inclusion along these 3 dimensions. Okay, we've got the team itself. We're looking at the quality of the team and how diversity shows up in not only their founders and C-suite, but their board of directors, and if they have employees, we're looking at that too. But really, at the time of investment, we're looking at those first 2. We're looking at policies. How much of their culture have they set up to be inclusive? What does their hiring and retention look like? What's their pay equity? Have they set policies in place so that as they grow, they're going to be a more solid company going forward? And then lastly, this is the sort of the who and how much the beneficiaries we're looking at. Does this technology specifically aim to solve problems that are being experienced by frontline communities, or those that are seeing the first and worst of the impacts of climate change? And so we might be thinking about, Cancer Alley in the South, or, some of the businesses that are close to manufacturing locations elsewhere around the country, or power plants, or a lot of the places that we're seeing frontline issues. So, their affordability and addressing the specific needs of those communities. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at. If these companies are knocking it out of the park on this, it makes a big difference to us in how we're looking at the rest of the whole picture. So this is, I'm going to leave the contact information up for a little bit, but because Bert asked about carbon emissions, there is something that I thought might be helpful to talk about, but I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute. I'll put my contact information in the chat in a little bit. Wanted to see, kind of by a show of hands, how many of you all have heard about the scopes of emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Okay, only seeing 2 hands, 3 hands. Okay, okay. So I'm gonna introduce that because I think it's another piece that's it's basic, but it's helpful to and thank you. I'm just seeing now, John, the posts that you've been making with the links. That's helpful. I'm going to share this one slide. This is actually, it's a different format because it's actually from our Cascadia Clean Tech Accelerator, because we cover this in there. Okay, here we are. So scope 1 emissions really are, oh, this is going through automatically somehow. All right, direct emissions or impacts from processes that you, the company, own or control directly. So this would be like your company vehicle emissions, the GHG emissions from the energy that you consume, the water you consume on site, waste you send, pollutants you emit. Scope 2 are connected to that, but not under your control. So like the greenhouse gases that are emitted at the power plant in order to be able to make it for you and maybe wasted in transmitting it to you. Scope 3 are all the other things. Your employee commuting, but most importantly, the impact of the use of the products that you've sold. And that's a huge one that we're looking at. We're looking at one company, their loan impacts. Sorry, I don't know why this is automatic. Your one company, is it going to have nearly the impact that your products will have over the lifetime of your business? So when we're talking about clean tech in particular, it's really most of that's going to happen in your scope 3. So that's what we tend to focus on. And when there are companies that are doing their own manufacturing and get to the scale where their direct emissions are going to, and their scope 1 and scope 2 are going to be really big, that's when you need to talk to somebody like Bert about the sustainability accounting, because then it gets to be a lot more complex. I think a lot of the companies that we work with, I'm not advising them to get into a whole lot around like complicated systems for accounting, because they don't have revenue coming in necessarily. Or if they do, it's minor in the grand scheme of things. We're trying to help them really more at like a design thinking scale at that point. The conversations that we're having with companies about their potential for impact are really trying to say, like, if you go after, X market, this is the kind of impact you have. If you expand also to this other, if you're also talking about this other market, you're going to double or triple your impact. And some of these conversations that we've had, like in our accelerator and things, have really opened their eyes to not just the potential for impact, but new ways of thinking about their company growth. It's one of the most exciting things about working in advising around impact is seeing some of those lights go on when you're having those discussions. Later, as companies develop more, it makes more sense to get into things like life cycle assessment, which is a very detailed accounting of where all of your impacts as a company can come from, or you would expect to see them come from. But if your product is at all still in development, it's not a wise investment necessarily, because if your ingredients change or your suppliers are changing, then a lot of the data that goes into your life cycle assessment or LCA is going to be different anyway. So I guess at this point, I would just turn it over to questions, because I have more questions for like where you all are and what questions you have about this space. And if I don't have the answer, I can certainly take notes and try to get back to you.
Most pre-seed companies are a couple of people, a crazy idea, maybe a couple of friends that said it was cool, and a prototype that was duct taped together. And so there's a bunch of things about accountability standards of any kind, including GAAP, that are outside their range of capability in some sense. I do not know of a fractional sustainability officer that would help make that work, but perhaps there's sort of the baby version for the pre-seed startup of what you just said.
Yeah. And I think, for folks that might be interested in participating in our accelerator program, that's definitely something that we coach folks through. Also, applicants to our funds, as soon as you're kind of getting into due diligence, we're tending to work with you on that in detail. As I mentioned before, there is that the website on our the page on our website that has a video where I'm just talking through the process of doing an emissions reduction potential assessment. So, it talks about Crane, it talks about another tool that's also, I would recommend looking into. It's called SERC, S-E-R-C, which was created by, Clean Energy Ventures Group. They have a very similar philosophy to ours around we're both looking all the way out to 2050 and looking at all the cumulative potential benefits, not just at the year 2050, which some investors do. Not to get into too much inside baseball, SERC is really the most close equivalent to what our methodology and philosophy is.
I'm finding lots of CERCs. There's a CERC in Australia at Berkeley and Carleton.
Let me work on getting that through. It says Clean Energy Venture Group, or CEVG. Simple Emissions Reduction Calculator Startups. I'll put the link in the chat here.
Okay, found it.
Joe, may I follow up to John's point there? how stringent are you all about asking for these things? Because like John mentioned, do we have a baby version? Because we could say that, you know, on the DEI aspect of what we're going to be doing is that by simply amplifying the flow of diversion of materials away from the landfill and stimulating deconstruction of buildings versus demolition of buildings, that is going to have a groundswell of activity in the deconstruction industry, labor jobs, and in communities that need that work and that sort of thing. And then in terms of the embodied carbon aspect of it and removing things from going into the waste channel and into the reuse channel is the optimal way, far better than recycling. So we haven't, as John was implying, we haven't quantified all that. We just know that we're going to make a damn big impact on it. And if we move the needle 1% on the diversion or 10% on the diversion, we've done something magnificent. And if we double what's going away, we've done something phenomenal. So that, I guess I'm asking, do you need a lot of numerical data to say
ultimately we like to get there. Ultimately, we'd like to get there, but at the time that you apply, you don't necessarily have to have it all figured out. We do want to see that we want to see the potential. We want to see a description, and this is all reasonably well described on our website as well. But I and my colleague Trisha, who's a chemist by training, but is a real whiz with doing these emission reduction potential analyses. She's really great at like walking people through and learning about your technology area and diving deep with you and kind of coaching you through that process. And that's something that we think is important enough for businesses. We think of it as like a service as part of our entrepreneurship support programs. Gotcha. So love to talk with you about it. I can tell you that we've worked with a couple of companies here in the Portland region that have a similar kind of business model. It sounds like from what you've said, and I think that the main thing is as John has intimated is scale and being able to understand how does this continue to grow and from a risk perspective, thinking about those 5 areas of impact, what's the potential for that to change if policies change, et cetera.
Okay,
Bert,
thank you.
Do you have a question?
Well, not so much. Well, sure. It's a question. Can you please describe a little bit about how you're working with the clean tech organizations here in Washington State? Because you're a regional organization and you've got the Cascadia Clean Tech Accelerator. Yeah. And so can you explain more about the scope of your reach? Because as I understand it, you guys have actually reached out all the way into Canada recently. That's pretty cool. Yeah. Tell us.
Canada, Alaska, Idaho, where our fund is open to companies anywhere in Canada and the US. You should do the same thing for your impact accounting. What do you mean?
So we had Tristan Cromer do a talk about how to do, like, in 4 hours, get from a fuzzy idea. So Larry's saying, I have this fuzzy idea of what I'm going to do. And as investors, we say, Larry, be more specific. And so we want him to do a 5-year cash flow projection. But we also, as impact investors, want to see some place where he's accounting in his financial modeling his impact, however he's measuring it. And so when he gets to year 5 and he's making 20 million a year in revenue, what does that mean in terms of his consequences of the impact he's intending to do? That's all I was trying to do. But then if
that's a really important point about the tight connection between growth and sales and impact, right? And so that's the place where the technical and financial due diligence touches our impact due diligence, right? Is looking at do the financial forecasts that we're talking about line up with the growth forecasts that we're using to estimate how much impact this company can have? And so we're looking for those things to align.
But that also means that in the quarterly report that we get as investors, there should be an impact line, right? This is what we did,
Correct.
right? And if you're not accounting for your impact at the same level of precision you're accounting for your finances, you're setting yourself up for trouble. It's my little
Got it.
soapbox.
Mhm. Yeah,
But
and
you
I
were
think it does
saying
say about the performance. Mhm.
you've expanded, so please don't let me interrupt that. That's a big deal.
Yeah. So, we started out in Oregon, where we're working actively in Washington and then in the rest of the region as well. The Cascadia Clean Tech Accelerator has been running for multiple years now and has long served both that whole region, but primarily through partnership with the Clean Tech Alliance. So that's one partnership. You asked about partnerships. The other is with the UW Clean Energy Test Beds those three entities, ourselves, Clean Tech Alliance, and UW Clean Energy Test Beds, have a program called the Northwest Clean Tech Innovation Network. And you can apply for any number of different programs, including assistance from Virtue Lab on finding and pursuing and applying for federal funding assistance for your technology development. So it's really wonderful R&D funding that's, no strings, well, not no strings attached. There's I'm sorry, I'm just keep getting distracted by the text.
It's a
I
grant.
should probably just
Yeah.
turn off my chat thing there.
Yep.
But non-dilutive funding for companies. It's all about developing your technology further, and so that's another program that we offer throughout the Pacific Northwest. And certainly, if you call me about your emissions reduction potential, that's something we can do anywhere. Any other questions?
I'd like to share something with you all.
Mm-hmm.
Way back in the day, I've been working in sustainable business and sustainability accounting since 1991, 30 years.
Going way back.
And my first job doing that was with the Washington Department of Ecology, where I wrote the state's guidelines for helping companies to measure the cost of hazardous waste disposal, because they were underestimating it so grossly. They didn't realize that the cost of throwing away a drum of paint waste went from $50 a drum to $500 a drum. And it was messing up all of their internal accounting. So I got involved with that a long time ago. So I've just put into the chat here a link to download my new webinar on how to do sustainability accounting. It's the PDF of the webinar slides.
Awesome.
And
That's
it'll show
amazing.
you how in any sector, well, actually, to be specific, in 77 sectors covered by the Sustainability Accounting Standard Boards, how to find very quickly the things that you entrepreneurs on this call and you investors on this call need to know about what to ask about what's important for the sector in which that company is in. Because, for example, in some companies, water is a really important issue. And if they're not accounting for it well, then you're going to be saying, why are you not doing this? And in other sectors, chemicals may be a completely different issue. And that's maybe the most important thing. But what's important to understand is that the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board has written very specific metrics for 77 different industry sectors. And you can get them all for free. Go to their website and download them. And whatever business you're in, there are probably metrics that have been published about what you should be talking about to be sustainable. And eventually people are going to say, if you don't know the answer to these questions, we're going to consider you to be high risk.
Yeah, so dive into that for Larry. What sector, which 77 sector does he fit into with the deconstruction company that deconstructs construction?
It would be in construction, which is a specific SASB sector. And they have published a detailed technical guidance and also very specifics. For example, the amount of construction waste that's recycled per ton per job. Okay, so that's you need to report on that. And if you can get to the point where you're saying, damn, we're getting down to 0, that's looking good, right? But they published this, and so now you can align what you are doing to perform well with the expectations of the investors who are already using the SASB standards to figure out, where am I going to put my money?
So typically the people that are putting money with impact are institutional investors, which are up a little bit in the stream, unless you're going to groups like Investor Circle or some of the other groups that are impact first investors, essentially. Alex, you have your hand up.
I have a question for Ken and Joe. So you talked earlier about balancing impact investment with returns. When you're communicating to investors, how do you almost quantify that balance for them so they feel comfortable with where you are in that spectrum?
Well, maybe I could weigh in a little bit there. I would say generically, that broad umbrella of impact investors, that answer would be quite different. Most of the money in impact investing is on the end of the spectrum, where what they're hoping for is market rate of return plus impact.
Very
and so in that case, when you're talking about that balance, that's essentially what a fund manager or a company might be saying. They might be saying, I'm going to give you market rate of return and I'm going to give you impact. So that's where most of the money in impact investing is today, and probably will continue to be, and it's growing quite a bit. We, on the other hand, because we're on the other end of that spectrum, we're closer to the philanthropic end of that spectrum. We're saying something quite odd to an investor, to an investor's ear. We're saying to the investor, we do not have an ROI target. We don't have a specific IRR that we're seeking to achieve along with our climate impact. And the reason we're doing that is because we can't. Under the IRS guidelines that we operate under, we can't invest for financial return. We can invest for impact, but not for financial return, not explicitly or not specifically at the point of making that investment. And so as the logic I walked through before, which is, if we don't pick the companies that are going to attract conventional capital and scale up commercially, we won't get the impact we're looking for. And so you could imagine, investor, you could imagine that we're on the seed venture capital spectrum when it comes to rate of return. But for a fund manager to say we don't have an ROI target is quite strange. But in the world that we're operating in, foundations, donor advised funds, that doesn't seem to really be a problem at all. They're accepting that logic because of the nature of their capital.
So if we talk a little bit about setting expectations, when angels are doing market rate of return for pre-seed, what rate of return is that you would say a pre-seed person is expecting?
John, you could probably answer that question better than I could.
I know, I'm trying to do some market validation here.
If it were me investing personally at the pre-seed stage, I would want 30% IRR because that's just super risky. And so if I were just thinking as a financial investor, those are the kind of numbers I'd be looking for, at least in that range.
And so we see from the Angel Capital Association and from the Halo report that typically we're seeing somewhere between 25 and 28% IRR is the norm of angel group returns. And so, that's a common number. So you're sort of hand waving your way away from that because your LPs are philanthropic LPs, typically. Right.
That's right.
Okay, cool.
But
Brian,
if we pick the right companies alongside angels and they scale up, then they're going to perform financially in that ballpark.
and you're putting your own capital into this, and so you actually have a regenerative capital fund that as you invest well, you get more money back into your fund to invest again, right?
Under some circumstances, and there's two different ways that would work. Number one, some participants in our fund gave us the money through a grant to the nonprofit as a stake. And so we then invest that in the fund, and whatever returns we get would be recycled into our charitable purpose. And then I also mentioned that 15% cap, that 15% compounded annual interest rate on the participation vehicle. If we have a home run in the fund and we pay back everybody's principal and interest, if there are returns above that, they would also go back to Virtue Lab for our charitable purpose. So we hope long-term that we will start to see that regeneration that you mentioned. That, we have a ways to go before that happens. We're starting to see the glimpses of that from our previous investing. And, we now have, a couple of exits. We had a couple of exits that had been grant funded. Now we've recently had a couple of exits that were investment funded. So that money's flowing back into Virtue Lab, and we can reapply that to our investing program.
Now, from a philanthropic point of view, I think the Impact Finance Center works to help people understand what regenerative capital looks like, rather than just 100% loss grants as the only way to be in philanthropic. There's a range of ways that you can engage in driving mission. So you can think about what part of your investment portfolio is philanthropic grants and what part of your philanthropic investment portfolio is rate of return investments. Any other questions and thoughts along the way? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, one small note. I do know of a late stage angel fund in the Seattle area that generally looks for 50% IRR. And so if you can't hit that, you don't get the investment. So that's a high bar, but that's the competitive landscape out there.
Any chance you can name names?
That would be the Sea Change Fund that looks for that.
Yeah, well, they think that they're an early stage fund at their behavior, but yes. Yep. Any other questions or thoughts along the way? Bina, this whole angel investing in impact thing is new? Yes?
Yes.
Any vocabulary questions that we can use to sort of drive the frame a little bit tighter?
Not at this point. I think there's a lot of new things to learn, but I think I don't have any questions about it. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to have you here. Scott asked if everything was annual, and yes, it is annual. When we say IRR, we mean annual returns. So normally we talk about 3x, and we're talking about, getting a 10x company in one of our companies, and you take and add all of the losses to all of the wins, and you get an overall portfolio of 3x, which then translates to somewhere between 15 and 30% IRR, depending on how badly you had to wait for the thing to come out. Any other thoughts? Mike, Seo, how about you? Any questions?
Yeah, I'm coming from community development finance institution background. Like we are almost only doing debt investment, not equity. So this whole new world is like, yeah, I was lost in the beginning, but now I think I'm getting this grip. But yeah, thank you for this opportunity to learn everything right now. Yeah.
Cool. There's a book by Looney Libs called Revenue-Based Financing, which is really a good sort of bridge conversation between what's going on with equity investment and debt investment. It sort of can work on both sides of the line. It's a worthwhile conversation, I think, to understand where that works. We have a company in town called lighter capital that does essentially venture debt at the Series A level. That's worth understanding their model. Bert, you have a question?
Well, it's not so much a question, but an observation, which is that when you're looking at alternative investments and you're using debt, that sustainability investments reduce risk. And if you reduce risk, you can use a lower discount rate in evaluating an investment that way. If you look at what you're doing today, and you know that it's got environmental compliance problems and excess emissions and all this stuff, you realize that's pretty high risk. What do you do with high risk investments? You discount them a lot. And if you invest in sustainability, you should be looking at it with a lower discount rate because it recognizes the benefit of those future savings or those future profits. And people who are working with debt should always be putting sustainability investments at the front of the file because they make more money and they reduce risk. But if you don't change the discount rate, you won't actually be recognizing the reality that sustainability reduces risk. And that's why we're doing it, so we don't screw up our planet.
The problem is you have to figure out who gets to catch the risk, who catches the consequence of the risk when, right? And part of this accountability is accounting for externalized
Absolutely.
Issues, right? And we're trying to bring some of those external issues into the accountability process, but we fail sometimes because the person who gets stuck with the sticky end of the stick is not us. So then we can smile and go to the bank and be happy. Joe, we have a bunch of investors who've been part of SAC here before. We've got companies here who've been in SAC before. Any questions of us that you would like to ask?
Well, I guess, I heard some really interesting, non-specifically climate technology areas mentioned around like life science and, I hesitate to say anything's not in climate because there's ways to do things better in any sector. But, if there are any other kinds of areas of impact that y'all have interest in or questions about, I might be able to help identify other resources.
So I did have an interesting take on things. So we are tracking where cars drive, and as a result, if you buy an EV, we can see the avoided tailpipe emissions in every neighborhood that you drive through. And so we can essentially quantify how effective incentives for EV adoption are on human health.
Beautiful.
This is something that not too many other people have even made those connections, but
Brian, who wants to pay you for that data?
Utilities are wanting that information because their regulators are required.
You know that I want you to tell me which utility and how much they're going to pay you this week. But thank you.
Well, it's not this week, but yes. Actually, next week, we're getting a contract with Avista, but yes, so.
Absolutely great. Thank you. Michelle Armstrong, sitting in your comfortable home instead of your comfortable car. Any questions got brought up by this conversation?
So a wonderful conversation, and Virtue Lab has been a great partner. I used to work for the Oregon Bioscience Association, and a wonderful education partner for our startups and small businesses there. So it's great to be on this side of the call. A lot of new vocabulary for me and a different way of thinking about things. So I'm one of the life science people that you were referring to, and there's definitely a portion of are startup companies that are looking at health impacts of, and specifically around like air quality, and it's given the fires and the smoke that was happening last summer. And then the other portion are more on therapeutics and medical devices. And so it started my mind thinking about the manufacturing processes and basically all of the upstream that happens. Currently, we have huge supply chain disruptions, and what is that doing for the transportation that's happening with our supply chains? So maybe taking it a little bit different direction, but certainly lots to think about. So I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank
I
you.
think one of the things that we're seeing is that, you know, particularly as the impacts of climate change are becoming more apparent and real to more people, we're definitely beginning to see how many ties there are to everything, you know, and, you know, public health is absolutely a key piece of that. So you know, tying back to what Brian, I think it was saying from flex charging, you know, that being able to quantify the reduction in public health risk associated with climate tech interventions or, you know, climate solutions is really key. And I'm going to be chewing on that for a little bit, actually, because we haven't really done much on that front. But, you know, it was just a really interesting conversation this morning with a group of climate justice leaders from all over the United States that were being convened by the Bezos Earth Fund and the Kapor Center. And we're having this really, it's several days of conversation about this, but the data around climate justice is a really huge topic. And, you know, just from what I gather, the Bezos Earth Fund is going to be really interested. And so when I think about who's interested in this information, I think there's some potential there too.
What was the other group besides the Bezos Earth Fund?
Kapor Center. It's also Kapor Capital. The Kapor Center is a nonprofit arm of the Kapor Capital that is focused on equity in tech.
John doesn't need much.
Yep. All right. There you go. So my perspective is that everybody who buys a car, heats a house, is having an impact. You ought to think about where your impact is. If you're spending money in your businesses, you're making an impact. And if you're angel investing, you're making an impact. You should choose that with intention rather than to just let it happen. So unicorn hunting without consequences considered from what that unicorn is doing. For instance, I have someone who is an addiction-oriented angel investor. They invest in things that cause people to be addicted, like coffee and other entertainment things that make people buy more and more of the same thing, which is exactly not what I will invest in. So consider carefully what your impact is when you write your angel check. With that, is there any last words from anyone, since we're coming to a good time to close?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next workshop for Seattle Angel Conference is Thursday with Bob Crimmins. We're going to explore the question of what's the consequences of seeking high valuations when you're in your pre-seed investment. So a lot of the times people get all excited about having that $12 million valuation, and that can be fine, but that has consequences. And so we're going to talk that out. And again, our deadline for companies to apply for Seattle Angel Conference is February 24th. Please reach out to John Dex or Alex or I, and we're glad to talk about what that means and get that going. Be sure to go down and find the 3 little dots and save the screen. I've been throwing lots and lots of things into the chat. There's likely something useful in there for you somewhere. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John, for putting this together. This is a great show.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.